Justin Sanderson, an investigative magazine journalist, suffering from PTSD, is going through a security check at an airport. At the airport, he meets Joe Beaumont, a former pilot and an alcoholic, who recognizes Justin from the debate on TV. Joe asks Justin to sign the magazine that Justin wrote, which he does. Just before boarding his flight, Justin calls his wife, and apologizes to her for raising his voice earlier. His wife doesn't want him to go to Tel Aviv, but he believes that going there is going to help him with his PTSD. He notices that his flight number is 1015, the date is October 15th, and his flight was delayed from 9:30 to 10:15. When boarding the flight, Justin exchanges his seat with a child, who couldn't get a seat with his parents. He notices Joe drinking on the same flight. At his seat, Justin notices an MP3 player that has a podcast playing, called Enigmatique. He puts on the headphones and starts listening to the podcast. The podcast starts narrating the events that are happening currently. The podcast says that the flight 1015 is going to disappear. The podcast starts explaining details surrounding the disappearance of flight 1015, starting with Captain Donner. Justin, baffled, tries to get his seat neighbor to listen to the podcast, but the seat neighbor gets up and leaves. Justin continues with the podcast. The podcast explains that the captain told air control about the flock of cormorants near the flight. The podcast explains that at 10:21, a bird struck the engine. Justin observes it happening in reality. He quickly throws the MP3 player and runs to the washroom. He goes back and calls the air hostess. He explains to them about the bird, but they tell him that at this altitude, there are no birds. Joe, sitting at his back, tells him that it was, indeed, a bird. He tells him that he is not a pilot anymore, because he made one too many mistakes. Justin continues with the podcast. According to podcast, pilot's last words were, "Good night, New York," and the flight disappeared at 11:15. 117 lives were lost. Flight disappeared over North Atlantic. Justin starts writing down the details. He goes to some passengers and asks them to turn their internet device off. Air hostess arrives and asks Justin to go back to his seat. He continues with the podcast, according to which, they had to consider passenger manifest, due to lack of forensic evidence. One particular passenger stands out, Igor Orlov, in witness protection, traveling to Tel Aviv to testify against Russian mafia. It might be that the mafia targeted the flight to kill Orlov. A U.S. air marshal was also on board, perhaps to protect Orlov. Justin goes to the air hostess and asks to talk to the air marshal. They tell him to go sit at his seat. He goes and meets up with Joe. Justin suspects Joe to be the air marshal. Joe denies it. Joe tells him that to spot a deceptive person, he has to act like a deceptive person. Justin starts going through passengers' luggage. A Russian passenger gets angry at him. He gets into an argument with the air hostess. Orlov arrives and gets angry. Passengers start making videos of Justin. Justin goes back to his seat and continues with the podcast. Podcast says that the last person of interest is an investigative reporter, Justin Sanderson, and videos of him causing disturbances were uploaded to internet right before the flight disappeared. Podcast then plays an audio, which is exactly what Justin was saying moments before. Justin tells the pilot to not say the words, "Good night, New York." Justin gets restrained by the air marshal on the plane. Pilot arrives and whispers something in Marshal's ear. She leaves, dropping the MP3 player behind. Justin picks it up and continues with the podcast. Joe arrives and tells Justin that he believes him. Justin tells Joe that since he is a pilot, he can land the plane safely before they vanish. Joe says that he doesn't know the code to the keypad to get into the flight deck. Justin realizes it's 10:15 and tells that to Joe. Joe says when he gets in there, he is going to drop the pressure, raise the temperature, and put everyone to sleep. Joe enters the cockpit and overpowers the crew. Once everyone is unconscious, Joe tells Justin that he taught him that past is past, and he can't get that back, but he got the opportunity to find peace and escape the past, only way possible. Joe says the words, "Good night, New York," and relaxes. Justin realizes he is the reason for the crash after all. After the crash, Justin survives and spots the MP3 player. He starts listening. Podcast explains that every passenger on the plane survived, except for one, Justin Sanderson. And to this day, he remains missing. Right then, Justin sees all the passengers, angry, and marching towards him. The episode ends with all the passengers beating him to death. Like and subscribe for more videos like this.